On today's Locked On Jayhawks deep dive into a possible transfer portal target, Jamir Watkins from Florida State.
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I'm Derek Johnson. You can give me a follow on Twitter at DJohnsonRadio. You can find our show here with Locked On Jayhawks anywhere you get your podcast, including on our YouTube page where you can like and subscribe to the show. And on today's edition of LOJ, we're talking Jamir Watkins, another player deep dive of another possible transfer portal option for KU to look into as things come closer to the NBA draft deadline and decisions having to be made and offseason decisions having to be made for KU. So we're going to get into Jamir Watkins, what's going on there, scouting report, possible fit with KU, and then we'll get to the latest in the offseason and what the big week ahead lies for KU. First, this episode of the show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started today. Okay, so Jamir Watkins, who is he? What's going on? What about his game? All that sort of stuff for KU. Well, Watkins is a wing transfer who is both in the portal and in the NBA draft process. Feels like we've been talking about those guys a lot here recently. And he was most recently at Florida State, where he was playing in the ACC for them. Seems like he's more of one of those kind of 50-50 decisions of, is he going to stay in the draft? Is he going to come back to school? By the time you've listened to this episode, he might have already decided which one of those two he will have, because that deadline decision is coming up here for everybody, including Johnny Furphy and others. Anyway, currently there have been no connected public rumors with Kansas about Watkins, but as we've kind of talked about, we've had some other deep dives where that's been the case. You know, maybe that's coming from, okay, maybe they're interested in somebody else, but what happens if somebody else they're interested in ends up going somewhere else or staying in the immediate draft or something? Do they open up their horizons a little bit more? Or is it just there hasn't been any public connections, but realistically, like, there actually is some interest there? Who knows? You never know. But I do think it's interesting going down this road in case you get there, because this is a really good player in the portal. He's listed at 6'7", 210 pounds. At the combine, though, he measured at 6'5" without shoes. So with shoes, you're looking at Watkins being about a 6'6" wing, 212 pounds, good wingspan size, 6'11". So with the 212 pounds, with the 6'11" wingspan, that basically gives you the opportunity to play him at the 3 or the 4. He originally, out of high school, went to VCU. He averaged 7 points per game as a freshman. That was in the COVID season in 2020 to 2021. Then the following season, he had a knee injury, and that kept him out of that full season. So now you're going in to the 2022 to 2023 season, which is his third, I guess, academic year at VCU. But because of the COVID year and then a season-long injury, he was going into that third season as just a third-year freshman in 2022 to 2023. He ended up having a really good year for VCU, even coming off the injury. 9.5 points per game for a solid VCU team. But I mean, considering you're coming off an injury, if he wouldn't have been coming off an injury, probably ends up averaging more, because he ends up transferring after that season to Florida State. And, you know, if you're a Florida State fan, or you're somebody who's watching and you're going, okay, we brought on a transfer from VCU. They're obviously a good basketball school, and he averaged 9.5 points per game there. Like, thoughts are probably, okay, maybe he can average 6, 7, 8 points per game here at Florida State. He ends up having an even better season, which I think probably coincides to me with the idea that it was after another year of him dealing with the injury and getting off that season-long knee injury at that point. And so in Tallahassee this past season, where he was, I guess, technically in his 4th season of college, where he would be a redshirt junior, I think is what he was listed at. But also he was actually technically a 4th-year sophomore due to COVID rules last season, meaning that if you're trying to count up, he has 2 more years of play this year and another one if he wants it for a COVID year. So that's an added bonus if you bring him on. But he started 33 games for Florida State this past season, played 28 minutes a night, and he averaged 15.2 points per game, 6 rebounds per game, 2.8 assists per game, 1.9 steals per game, and 0.8 blocks per game. So really filled up the stat sheet, did a little bit of everything for his team. And he did that all while shooting relatively efficiently from the field, 45.7% from the floor, 34.4% from three, and 79.5% on free throws. The one kind of note there, though, only 2.9 3-point attempts per game. We've had a lot of these conversations about Kansas needing players who, not just shoot relatively efficiently from three, but also high volume, because DeJuan Harris isn't going to shoot high volume. Hunter Dickinson isn't going to shoot high volume. KJ Adams, when he's on the floor, isn't going to really shoot at all. So you need guys who are shooting efficiently and shooting at high volume. He shot it efficiently enough that's above average, 34.4%, not super high volume. Then again, the fact that you've brought in already guys like Zeke Mayo, and you're hoping that AJ Storr with better help around him can get up to that more efficient level. Rylan Griffin certainly classifies for, good shooter on high volume and efficiency, just like Zeke Mayo does. That maybe by adding those guys, it makes it okay to have, more of an above average percentage on average to below average volume. I don't know. Either way, really good player, super productive player, who in ACC only games, Watkins wound up in the top 20 individually in ACC only games in true shooting percentage, defensive rebound rate, block percentage, steal rate, fouls drawn per 40 minutes, free throw rate, and free throw percentage. So, ultra productive player who did a lot of things that could impact winning. Unfortunately, Florida State didn't win as many games as maybe he would have hoped. It wasn't, a disaster or anything like that. Florida State finished 79th on KenPom. They were 17-16 above 500. So that's one spot ahead of Samford, or Syracuse. That's two spots ahead of Samford. You're ahead of Georgia, who won 20 games. You're ahead of Yale, who won an NCAA tournament game. You're ahead of Indiana. So, it's not, bringing on a player from top 25 team or bringing on a Final Four starter like Rylan Griffin, but it's not like they were a disaster that you have to worry about. How much does this impact winning? He's been on a lot of winning teams at VCU, and then Florida State was at least, an above 500 team in the ACC. Here's some synergy numbers of note for Jamir Watkins. He was in the 80th percentile as a pick and roll ball handler. So really good. Obviously this long athletic wing, you set him up with a ball screen, give him a lane to the rim, was really good at converting those into scoring chances for Florida State. He only ranked in the 37th percentile in transition, which that surprised me given the length and athleticism and wing ability. And typically when I think of Florida State under Leonard Hamilton, I think of teams that are going to do really well defensively, do really well with their size, and get out in transition and score. Maybe aren't going to be the best half-court teams because they just have all sorts of athletes and size, but they haven't really been that classic Florida State the last 2 or 3 years, maybe even 4 years under the program, really since the COVID year. So I don't know. I found that a little bit interesting. 57th percentile in isolation, so at least above average in some of those isolation scoring settings. He was in the 80th percentile on offensive rebound putbacks. So he was somebody who was getting a good amount of offensive rebounds, and he was putting them back at a really high clip when he got them. 50th percentile on dribble jumpers, so about average there. 42nd percentile on runners, and then 53rd percentile at the rim. That's another number that I was surprised wasn't a little bit higher given, lengthy wing who's able to slash and everything. But I do wonder how much of the 53rd percentile at the rim has to do with Florida State just not being that great of a team. And that's something where maybe you just don't have the spacing to kind of open up those lanes, because Florida State finished 288th in the country last year, 31.7% from three in 3-point shooting. And they were doing it on the 307th highest rate of basically how many threes are they taking per game. So you're not getting much spacing. The court's going to be condensed. So 53rd percentile at the rim, if you get on a team that has better spacing, which that's the hope for Kansas this year with all the transfers they added, maybe you finish in the 75th percentile at the rim. And then that's a big difference. He was also in the 75th percentile as a spot up shooter. He went 17 of 40. That's good for 42.5% from three. So was good in more limited volume on spot up shooting. 69th percentile in catch and shoot three, or catch and shoot all opportunities. Specifically on catch and shoot threes, he went 19 of 52. That's 36.5%. He was 10 of 20 on unguarded catch and shoot threes, which he would probably be getting more of at Kansas than he did at Florida State. The defense is an interesting conversation because he only ranked in the 12th percentile on synergy, But you look at the steals per game in which he averaged 1.9. You look at the blocks per game in which he averaged 0.8. You look at the steal rate and the block rate, both very good. And the synergy numbers not reflective of that, only in the 12th percentile. Now, does that mean that he's just a gambler and not a sound defender? I do think sometimes people confuse, hey, you average a lot of blocks or steals or one or the other or whatever, and you're a great defender because of that. That doesn't always indicate that. That means that you're more of a risk taker, you're more of a gambler. Now, some guys like Marcus Garrett gets 2+ steals per game, and he was a lockdown defender, right? Other guys were just more opportunists. Like I've heard Bill Self before rag on Mario Chalmers saying, yeah, you weren't a good defender. You just got steals. And Mario Chalmers won like Big 12 Defensive Player of the Year because people just looked at the steal numbers, even though Bill Self was like, no, you were not a very good defender. You were just an opportunistic defender, which you were allowed to because Brandon Rush was a good defender and Russell Robinson was a good defender. So it was actually better to have that. And it's like a corner in football, right? It's like you have some guys who are, they're going to get burned every now and then, but they're also going to get a big pick six. But sometimes that can be just as valuable because it's going to lead to scoring the other way. So is he more of a gambler? Is he not a sound defender? Are those numbers tainted by Florida State not being a great team that went just 17-16? But then again, they were 75th on defense. Again, that's not like, that's not great, but it's not an abject disaster. So I don't know. Then there's this to consider. He ranked in the 88th percentile on defense on synergy as a freshman at VCU, and then a 96th percentile in his final season with the Rams in the 2022-23 season on the defensive end. So 96th and 88th percentile in those 2 years. I think I'm going to chalk it up as he is a very good defender. Maybe got a little lazier at times at Florida State with a bigger offensive role, not on a great team. But if you scale down the role and you see some of the length and the versatility, I expect him to be a good defender if you hypothetically brought him on. Let's talk more about the fit with KU on this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. First, this episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. It is winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. You can get in on the NBA playoff action, NHL playoff action. Playoff hockey is so fun. We have the RBC Canadian Open this week. In golf, you can get futures for college football, NFL, win total over-unders, who's going to the Super Bowl, who's going to win the Heisman. You can also today, this is coming out on a Tuesday, here in Kansas, they do these Dinger Tuesdays where you can bet $25 on somebody to hit a home run. And after you opt in and make sure you hit all the pre-listed requisites, then you're going to get $5 in bonus bets for every home run that's hit in the game, whether your guy hits a home run or not. So if your player hits a home run and there's like 6 home runs hit, you're sitting pretty, right? So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook and official sportsbook partner of the Locked On Podcast Network. All right, continuing on, possible fit with Jamir Watkins if KU were to be interested or if he were to wind up at Kansas. It becomes a little bit tougher when we're talking about the lack of that three-point volume. Again, 34% from three is above average, 3 attempts per game. That's not like, 1 attempt per game, but it's like DeJuan Harris was at 38% from three on 2.1 attempts per game. So it's almost 1 extra 3 per game on a little lower volume, right? So then the question, or a little lower efficiency, excuse me. So the question then becomes, have you added enough shooting elsewhere to make it work? Or is this a non-negotiable to bring on a kid like this, given that you do have the base of DeJuan Harris, KJ Adams, and Hunter Dickinson, to where, whether KJ is going to start or not, he's still going to play starter level minutes. And so if you're throwing out those 3 guys on the floor, if DeJuan's playing 30 plus minutes a night and Hunter's playing 28, 30, 32 minutes a night, and KJ's playing 24, 26, 28, 30 minutes a night, is there enough shooting there to make that work? That kind of becomes the question with how it fits on the court. But he is a really good player. He would be in contention to start. Certainly he'd be in the rotation. I think it would kind of come down to, at that point, again, like DeJuan and Hunter in the starting lineup. I expect AJ Storr, again, to be kind of a lock in the starting lineup. Then it becomes a question to me. I think Rylan Griffin will be a starter. But I guess you're in competition with Rylan Griffin. You're also in competition with, even though they're not at the same position, with KJ Adams, although I guess technically Watkins could play some 4 just as KJ would. Would KJ start? Would he not? Would you start? You get into some of these different lineups of how you could possibly make it work. And I think when you look at what Watkins would bring to the table, he would, in theory, to me, be KU's best defensive player, maybe not named DeJuan Harris. And I think because he would be a wing that would have more switchability or ability to guard different positions, maybe a little bit better, maybe he would end up being your best defender if you get back to those kind of VCU numbers in there. So that would be the additive of bringing him. And I know, like I said, the transition numbers weren't great. I'm almost going to chalk that up to Florida State not having a well-spaced court or not being a great team that probably didn't handle those transition opportunities well. I think on a team that has Hunter Dickinson, who is an excellent outlet passer, has DeJuan Harris, who is obviously a very good passer, especially in the open floor, has KJ Adams, who even as a kind of 4-5 man can grab and go and lead a break. And we see KJ all the time come up with games with 3, 4, 5 assists. That he would be much better in transition with having that athletic wing. So I almost view him as a Kevin McCullough kind of replacement. And I don't mean that you're going to get the same production out of Kevin McCullough. Kevin McCullough, prior to the injuries, was on pace to, probably end up on the second or third team All-American list, right? And I don't know that that would be the expectation here, but the idea of, okay, an athletic wing who's 6'6", he actually has a bigger wingspan than Kevin does, who averages about 6 rebounds per game. Good defensive rebounder. That was the case with Kevin. Watkins was averaging almost 3 assists per game. Kevin was a solid passer, right? You get a player who's not taking a ton of threes, just like kind of Kevin was, except you actually have even better track record here from 3, just a little bit over Kevin. I think you could make that work in a very real way that it would be very interesting to me. And then you would have kind of different lineups you could throw out. You could, play your all defensive lineup if you're up late in a game where you have DeJuan Harris at the point guard and Jamir Watkins at the 3, and who knows who ends up being the best, 2 defender, maybe Marco Jaxson on paper right now. And at the 4, you're playing KJ, and at the 5, you're playing Hunter. If they have a stretch 5, you're playing KJ at the 5, or I don't know, Flory at the 5 to get a shot, whatever it is. You can mix and match in a lot of different ways. So I think for me, this would be a take. Again, we haven't heard any connections here with Kansas. There's also the part that he's a possible NBA draft pick. I think he was 73rd on Sam Vecini of The Athletic, his big board, meaning he could squeak into that late second or at least get, one of the top undrafted deals after the draft. Seems like it's more 50-50 whether he winds up in the draft or not. Then after that, you're talking about, okay, does he wind up at KU or not? If we're talking about who to take, I would take Jaxson Robinson over him because you don't have to worry about the shooting. Now, obviously, I feel better about the defense here with Watkins than I would with Robinson, but I just think Robinson is that good of a scorer and a shooter that I would take that. I'd probably also still take Wooga Poplar over him because I know that Poplar can scale down the role. We saw that when he was on a starter on the Final Four team with Miami, where he was more of the 4th or 5th option when he was on the court. And I trust his defense as well, even though I think Watkins has a higher ceiling for defense than Poplar, but maybe the floor, I don't know. I guess that would be debatable given Poplar kind of had up and down back-to-back seasons. But I think I'd probably take those 2 guys. But this would definitely be a take for me, right, with Watkins. I think he'd be a very good player. And even if it's not as seamless as a fit as maybe those 2 guys, it still is a fit that you could make work and would just be adding a really good player to the roster. All right, let's talk about the latest in the transfer portal and the offseason for KU on Locked On Jayhawks. Talking the latest in the offseason and transfer portal here with Locked On Jayhawks here. Thanks for tuning into the show, and thank you to everydayers tuning into each and every episode of the show. We're going to have an episode coming soon. Could be tomorrow. Could be Thursday, because Johnny Furphy is running out of time to decide. And again, by the time you listen to this, who knows? Maybe a decision has already been made. The deadline for players deciding whether they're staying in the NBA draft or withdrawing their name and coming back to college is May 29th at 11:59 p.m. Right? So basically midnight between Wednesday going into Thursday. So that means, you listen to this on a Tuesday, Johnny Furphy has, 24, 36 hours, whatever it is, to decide on what his future is going to be. Is he going to come back? Is he going to stay in the NBA draft? So we will have a more clear distinction on that, but it's not just Johnny Furphy where that decision comes into play. It's some of the other guys like Jaxson Robinson, transferring from BYU. Is he going to stay in the draft or is he going to come back? Certainly seems like that could be 50-50. And I think some of these players, to a certain extent, probably try to play it as far as they can. Like, even if you're a player who's like, I am going to end up coming back and transferring, it might not be the worst thing in the world for you if you wait till the very last minute to try to convince schools that, hey, I really am thinking about staying in the NBA draft, but I will come back if you can sweeten that NIL deal a little bit. You can give me an extra $100K on that NIL deal. Okay, I'll come back for that. And then maybe it's a little bit of a game of chicken there. I don't know how much that happens or how much that is happening, but I certainly wouldn't rule that out. The other bit of news of one guy who was going through that process and had to make a decision and since has and now picked the school he's going to be going to, somebody we did a deep dive on, Chaz Lanier, the transfer from North Florida. He's going to Tennessee. So that'll be very interesting because they had Dalton Connect come from a smaller school who's putting up big numbers and he just went off. I'll be interested to see with Chaz Lanier if he can kind of follow in those footsteps of Connect, that he's now going to the Vols, and one less transfer portal target is off the board possibly for KU. So stick around. We will make sure we get something on Johnny Furphy when that decision comes down, as well as Jaxson Robinson and anybody else who's pertinent for you. So we'll get to all that here. Make sure you subscribe to the show anywhere you get your podcast with Locked On Jayhawks, including subscribing on our YouTube page. We'll see you next time with LOJ.